All right, with potentially buying a house over here, what we're going to do is we're going to start a fundraiser where you can bet today what chapter from Mark 6 through 10 I will be preach on next week. And so if you do like a 50-50 raffle kind of thing, it's $20 a shot. I'm kidding people. Get a little nervous, I can tell you. Nervous? I'm not kidding. Okay? Never mind. So if you last week you guessed Mark 1, you've been a winner today. And Luke 1. All right, Luke chapter 1, and I don't know how you come back from talking about that. I was going to do it. I was going to go. Today we're going to talk about certainty disrupted. Every single human being needs to make sense of their life, right? It's something that everyone needs to do. And we have to settle on who we believe. We settle on who we will become, and when it comes to settling on what you will do, all of those things, what you believe, what you'll be, what you will do, is not something that any other human can do for you. And when humans try to do that for you, it's usually a very bad relationship in the long run. Every person has to make sense of their existence. I love listening to songs every so often that are very existential. Just makes me think, just sometimes about lyrics. I'm not talking about Christian songs, I'm talking about just certain songs and things like that just make me listen to how the person is talking about life. Sometimes they'll make me sad for the person, who wrote the song and who's singing it. Where's their hope? It just literally makes me think about evangelism and reaching people and, watching people try to make sense of existence. Or when you watch movies and TV shows where the things that give people purpose, a lot of times, we watch for entertainment, but then if you really stop and thought about it, you think about just how sad their pursuit of what is in life. And we're trying to make sense of our existence, right? We're going to decide what we think about God, we think about how we got here, we think about what gives us meaning and purpose. And we're all trying to do the same thing, and we're trying to arrive at certainty. And the first few verses of Luke 1 show us what happens in the human mind that leads us there. Luke 1:1 is going to come up on the screen, and it says that there are pieces, right? It says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. And again, we're cutting off in the middle of the sentence there. But I know the word pieces is not in the text, but the idea is, right, that people are trying to compile a narrative. When you compile something, it's when you have data points and fragments and experiences, and you try to take those and turn those into one cohesive story. And we take what we have seen, we take what we hear, we take what we have lived and experienced, and we try to put it together into a story, right? And Luke 1:3 says, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So if you see there on that third line into the fourth, right? To write an orderly account. So the Luke, who wrote this, he was a companion of the Apostle Paul. He was also a physician. He's saying we take pieces and we put them in order. That's what he's trying to do for them. Right? He's trying to take all these pieces of everything that's out there about Jesus, and I'm trying to put them into a document or narrative, is the word the ESV uses. Right? And we put them in order, we form that narrative, and that narrative gives us something we want, which is a sense of certainty, right? Verse 4. Right? He said, I wrote this, orderly account, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Right? This is universal. This is every person, whether or not they're a Christian, is taking the pieces of this life and they're arranging them into a story and trying to live with certainty about what that story means. There's a reason we do this. People who study psychology, human behavior, will tell you that we're constantly trying to form a coherent story of our lives that makes sense. Right? We take events, we take relationships, we take conversations, we take successes, we take failures, and we arrange them into something that makes sense. And we sometimes do that at the expense of truth. Right? I remember years ago, I had this issue with, I remember my wife would correct me, not like in a bad way, but sometimes like something would happen, and I would remember it in an order that was funnier if it happened that way than it actually happened. Right? Like I would think back on something and I would say like, oh, I remember like this happened and you said that and someone said that. I'm like, well, no, not exactly. You're kind of really, it would have been really funny if it happened in that order. But that's really the way I would remember it in my head and think about it. Because I don't know if I just felt like we need some levity in life. I don't know, or it was like too serious of a situation and trying to make a joke about it, right? Or but we do things like that, right? We do things like that with our past, and they can have twists on it. So we do that because we don't live well with randomness. We don't live well with contradiction. We don't live well with pieces that don't fit. So we take pieces, we put them in order, and we arrive at some kind of certainty. And once we have that story, and it's we feel like it's a well-written story that works for us, we tend to hold on to it. And then we start taking that story and we interpret our new experiences through it. We explain away what doesn't fit. We rehash what happened in the past, and we'll remember it a little differently maybe than it actually happened. We remember it how it fits our narrative, right? And we protect the version of the story that helps us make sense of our life. Now we can do that mentally in order of the past, but then things come into our present that we can't control. And the present has a way of disrupting the story we thought we understood. Right? Something happens that doesn't fit our narrative. Something breaks that we thought was secure. Something changes that we thought was settled. And when that happens, questions come. Like, what story is being written? Is God behind this? Is God even care about this anymore? Is he involved? And we ask these questions because disruptions don't just confuse us. They threaten the certainty that we built. We see this immediately in Luke's gospel. Right? Zechariah has a story. He's a good man. He's a righteous man. He's a blameless man. He's an old man. Him and his wife are childless. Right? And they have these years of disappointment. They have these years of unanswered prayer. They have these years of silence. And at some point, this is conjecture, right? It's not exactly like this in the Bible. But at some point, you could see him just sort of saying, this is just how life is. Right? Like expectations have settled. On a national level, they've been waiting for the king to return. Right? They've been waiting for God to come back. And this is going on 400 years now at this point, or over 400 years, that God has not spoken, that they are not the kingdom that God had planned for them to be. And so when an angel appears, everything is destroyed. Right? The angel comes, and now all of a sudden God's speaking, and God is acting, and God is intervening, and he's explaining to Zechariah, this is the plan. Your son is going to be the person who comes before my king, my Messiah, who's also going to be born. And Zechariah hears all this, and he reacts with doubt. And he says, how shall I, this is not going to happen. Like, I'm old, my wife is old. Right? And to him, it's like, this doesn't fit my story. Right? My story has become, I'm an old man who lives in a nation that is somewhat desolate and desperate to become what it once became. And I prayed for children, and we prayed for this, and we never had them. And now you're telling me at this old age, which doesn't make any sense, first of all, that we're going to have a child, and this doesn't fit the story I have settled on over these past decades of disappointment and waiting and just going through the motions. And what you see is, that's not just Zechariah, that's us. right? We all can live with a broken story as long as it's predictable. We can live with our broken story as long as we have ordered it in some way that it doesn't hurt all the time. And, maybe we have a different angle on something, that we change in our minds how maybe something happened in the past. And, we believe versions of lies of what the past was. And we are stuck with that story and thinking like, I'm okay with being stuck with this story as long as it's predictable. Right? And when we want these things to be predictable, when God begins to act, it doesn't immediately feel comforting. It feels disruptive. Right? You see it with Mary. He comes to Mary and tells her, you're going to be the mother of the Christ, and there's not going to be a father. Like, I'm going to conceive the baby in you. And even in her talking back then, she's like, that doesn't fit with biology. Right? That doesn't fit social expectations. It does not fit the life she would have planned. Yet her response is completely different. Right? It's let it be to me according to your word. We see it with the shepherds. You see the shepherds out in the field, and the angel comes, and there's a choir of angels singing, and they're just like, well, we're just shepherds. We're doing this, but God challenges them and disrupts their quietness, and He pushes them forward, and they are the ones who receive this announcement, and they're the ones who go and spread it to other people. Right? The story of Israel was being rewritten. God steps in. Luke is showing these people, like, there are more pieces to compile, to consider, and we have to stop and think, what if what God is doing does not fit with the order I have created in my life? What if it doesn't fit with the certainty I have created? What if what God is doing destroys my certainty? Right? That is the path of everyone who's a believer. Especially the older you were when you got saved. Right? You have this way of life that you live. And it makes sense to you. You look back now, if you're saved on it, and just think like, ooh, why did I think that way? Why did I live that way? Why was I okay with those things? And that story is being rewritten, and we understand as it is being rewritten, it can be very painful. Right? It is the path of every person who follows Jesus as his disciple. A person who follows Jesus as his disciple is going to have Jesus come to him. He's going to have the Word of God come to him, the Holy Spirit come to him, and say, like, Matt, that's not okay. Matt, you need to change that. Matt, it's not okay to live with that sin. It's not okay to think that. It's not okay to have a heart like that, right? It's not okay to keep doing that and excusing that away. And, the fact is, this goes a little bit back to 2 years ago. We talked a lot about the conscience, right? And we tell ourselves lies that make it okay for why I can sin and why I can do something. And God is trying to disrupt that. And I find certainty, right? Like I'll find that there's something in my life, in my heart, in my past that really hurts, and I wanna sometimes, like, I know how to medicate that for myself. Right? Like, I know how to take care of that, whether it's physically or whether it's mentally or in my heart. I know what to do to stop my pain, my suffering, or my pity I have for myself, or whatever it is. And God is coming and saying, no, that's not how I want you to deal with that. You have justified in your heart that it's okay for you to be a certain way based on how things once were. And he says, I'm coming in to disrupt. Right? And he gets to Zechariah. And Zechariah is like a man, he's a faithless man. Like, what pushed this old man to faithlessness and just going through the motions, doing his duty? And Jesus came to him as an old man, and he was like, the angel came to him, this old man, and it's like, no, it's not okay. He's like, it's going to get exciting. You're going to have a baby in your house. Right? And Zechariah is just like, no, this doesn't make any sense. When God comes and disrupts stuff, it often doesn't make sense. It messes up the orderly account of the life that we've been compiling. And he wants us to write it. It hurts us a lot because we're not certain. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a long story. Back years ago. This is 33 years ago. 33 years ago. It was January 22nd, 1993. I had just started my second semester of college, and I was at work. And I worked in a department store, and I was in the warehouse, and there was a radio station up. It was a music station, but they were doing the news at the top of the hour. And on January 22nd, 1993, the person doing the news says, today is the 20-year anniversary of the decision to legalize abortion in America for Roe versus Wade. And I just remember that the statement just stuck with me, and I just kept thinking about it. And it was something where I knew some people who had abortions, and I was hurt for them. And as I was thinking that day at work, I came up with an idea about a book or a novel. And it was a twist on, like, what would it mean, like a twist on what it would mean to be pro-choice. And I had this idea, like, I was like, what if, like, somehow the government mandated that certain pregnancies had an end, and you wanted to choose to keep your baby? Right? Like, I was just thinking about kind of like the inverse, like, twisting that around. And so I have a very, creative, fantastical mind. And sometimes I know people who are in meetings with me, they don't like my fantastical mind, because either it gives them more work to do, or I'm not paying attention to what they're asking me, I just start thinking about something else, like something else we do that's more exciting than accounting subject, right? And so we, I was at work, and I just kept thinking about it, and I used to write a lot, and I had these just big composition notebooks, not like the regular size ones, like they were bigger. Write out the story in there. Yes, we had computers. I just like writing by hand then. And I would go to like places around where I lived in New York, and go by the Hudson River and sit on rocks and by trees and stuff. And I would just write and create characters and backstories and motives. Well, as college went on, it just got a lot harder to find time to do that, because college got harder. I had less time for writing. I'd write a little here and there through the end of my undergrad and graduate schools. I moved here, and really for 9 years, I didn't write anything of my own. I worked on stuff for other people. And it was around the time my daughter was born. I just really wanted to get back into writing. I was having an itch for a creative outlet. So I picked up my book, and I started typing out what I'd written on the laptop, and I just started expanding the story. I wrote. I joined online writing groups, and I entered a national contest in 2012. I entered a national contest for the best first 15 pages of an unpublished author. And I edited, and I really polished those first 15 pages, and I submitted them, and I became a finalist in the category that I had submitted for. And when they announced the winners, I won. And so winning the contest got what I had written in front of agents. And there was this one agent who was very successful, a literary agent, who I had met with once before, and I was excited about him looking at it. And he took my whole book, and he said, I read this, and my assistant read it. And he said, Matt, this book is so close. It's like so close to being like really good. And he said two things, really three things that stuck out with me. One is, he said, if you could make the last 385 pages as polished as the first 15 that you've done, he said, you would get a publishing contract, and I believe someone would like buy the movie rights to this. And he said, now I'm going to tell you something else that you're not going to like. He said, you could work on this book, but I'm going to tell you what you need to do if you want to be a published author. And I was like, I want to be. Like tell me, I'm ready to listen to him. And he said to me, forget this book. He's like, forget this story that you've been putting together in your head. He said, you need to write it completely different. He said, you're so close to all these events that you made up in this book. It's been a part of your life for 19 years. You think things about these characters, you believe things about these characters, you love them like no one ever will. And he said, you're going to have a hard time pulling your heart away from them and being objective. He said, start over a new story with new characters, apply what you learned about writing. And he He said it'll take a really long time before you can really ever go back to that. Because you're just like, you're mired in it. You're mired in all the stories that you have put together to create this. And there's something about it, which he explained to me, isn't worth going into, that it lacks the cohesiveness that a good story is going to have. Because you know how it is. You ever like read a book and you watch stuff and you're just like, that's inconsistent. Right? You know, like you're like, that's inconsistent with the story world. No, those kind of things, right? And he was explaining to me, he's like, you in your mind think this is great. He goes, but someone who's able to look at this objectively and look at all these things you put together, he's like, there are some problems with it. Just write a new story. Right? And that's what God is doing with us. Right? Like we have these stories that we have compiled and we have put together and to form some kind of narrative. And the fact is, whether it's if someone could look at it objectively or hopefully you get this straightened out before Judgment Day, that God's going to look at that and say, no, you've built it on lies. You know, you've built it on half-truths and twists. And he's like, I'm coming and I'm trying to write a new story into the hurt and the pain and the disappointment and the lack of answered prayers, and you were crying out for things that it wasn't time to have those yet. You know, Peter understood how that world works, right? In Luke 5, he knew fishing, right? He knew the fishing world. He knew the lake. He knew the storms. He knew that, you know, usually when you were fishing all night and you caught nothing, you would waste your time throwing the net back in the water the next morning as the water's warming up. That's his service. And then Jesus steps into his boat. And he says, why don't you put out the net into the deep and let down your nets for a catch? And Peter says, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. Right? And what's behind that is he's saying, like, I know about fishing. This doesn't fit what I know. But at your word, I will do it. And he obeys. And suddenly, the reality and the story that Peter knew about fishing doesn't make sense because Jesus has stepped in and that net, as they're pulling it up, is breaking. They have to call the other boats over because they have such a tremendous haul of fish. And Peter's conclusion is not just about fish. He's like, would you depart from me? Because I'm a sinful man, O Lord. And you see, what happened? Jesus just obliterated his certainty. Jesus came and showed him. What you are certain of, you should not be certain. I am what you should be certain of. He said, you've been a fisher of fish, now you're going to be a fisher of men. And Jesus looks at Peter and he says, we're going to write a new story. And that's what we need to see. When Jesus enters the story, things don't immediately make more sense. They often make less sense at first. Why? Because what he brings is not just an improvement on our story. He is bringing us into a completely different kind of world. I'll use the example. When I was called to preach, I had lived in New York my whole life. I had moved to North Carolina. It was like the 4th week I was there in church, and God called me to ministry and to go to Bible college. And I remember just the confusion of thinking like, no, I'm just getting settled in here, to work on my graduate studies. It doesn't make sense that why didn't you do this like a year ago? Before I was thinking like, I'm gonna move and get into the grad school I want to get into and start like, why are you doing this now? Why don't you wait until I'm done with grad school and let me finish what I want to finish, and then we can think about it? Well, God, neither of those are his choices, right? He's like, no, we're going to work on this now. Like, we're going to work on this now. I'm coming to you now, in this time where it made sense to you to apply to these schools and come here and stuff. Okay, now we're going to test it and see, are you ready for the disruption? Are you ready for the disruption? See, we struggle with God's disruptions because we have built our understanding inside of an entire world and system that is marked by sin and death. So we adjust our expectations to that. Right? In our lives, we expect brokenness. In our lives, we expect limitation. In our lives, we expect things to stay the same. Do you realize that in a sinless world, within God's kingdom that he is building, none of those exist? None of those exist. Do you think God wants sickness to happen? Do you think God designed the world like, I'm going to make people you're going to die of cancer. And he's smiling. You think God is thinking like, oh, I can't wait to make these men and women and then have them, I can't wait for 9/11. I can't wait. Can't wait for 3,000 people. New York City to get shut down. Financial systems to crash. No, that's not who God is. Right? But sin and death. Right? He's given us choices, and we've chosen sin and death. We've chosen disobedience. And that's the world that we have grown up in and live in and expect. That's why, can you understand what it must have been like when Jesus is walking around healing people, and there are people who their whole life have been sick, who have been mute and deaf and crippled, and all of a sudden this is like, that's just the way it always is. Right? Or think about the guy sitting at the temple gate watching Peter and John walk by, and he's like, can I just have money? This is what I do every day. I just ask for money, and this is my life, the rest of my life. Someone has to carry me here, and someone's going to carry me home. And here, can you put money in my cup? And Peter's like, no, I'm not putting money in your cup. I don't even have any money. He goes, let me tell you what I do have. It's the power of Jesus Christ. It's the power of His kingdom. So why don't you come here and stand up and just walk and go get a job? Right? Like, you can now fend for yourself. You can have a family. You can have a wife. You can have a career. You can do this because that is what God's kingdom is like. And when God's kingdom is breaking through and God is doing something, He gives us these glimpses into it. Just like He did with Peter. And He's like, man, you didn't catch any fish all night? I bet you Jesus made them not catch any fish that night. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wasn't going to say that. This is what I'm thinking, right? He's probably like, I'm going to let them suffer. I'm going to let them, keep going thinking about doing life how you want to do it, and then tomorrow morning I'm going to demonstrate what it's like when you do life like I want you. The kingdom of God is not shaped by death. It is not shaped by sin. It is not bound by what we have experienced. So when Jesus steps in, it doesn't fit with the way that we think things are supposed to fit. For so many people, like your whole life has been like, everyone's against you. It almost doesn't make sense that you have an advocate in the Holy Spirit. We have these struggles that are it's understandable because we just look, and in our mental state we're like, this is how life is. This is how bad it is. And Jesus steps in and He disrupts that. Every person here has a story. You have taken the pieces of your life and you have arranged them into something that makes sense to you. You have drawn conclusions about God, about yourself, about what is possible, about what is not possible, and you have some level of certainty about it. But the question isn't whether you have certainty. The question is, what is your certainty built on? Is your certainty, like when you have taken the pieces and you have made an orderly account of them to create some level of certainty in your life, is that certainty just built on experiences or expectations, everything you've seen so far, what you've concluded life must be? Because what Luke said to Theophilus is, he's like, I'm going to take these pieces and I'm going to compile them into a narrative or a story that is an orderly account that makes sense. We're all trying to do that. And he says, so that you can be certain about the things that you have heard about Jesus Christ. When God begins to work, to bring, it's a very different brand and flavor of certainty. It's not going to feel comforting at first. And it's going to feel like everything is being disrupted. But what if the disruption is the start of something better? Right, when Luke said, I wrote this, you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught. It wasn't a certainty built on assumptions. It wasn't a certainty built on what you've experienced. It wasn't a certainty built It was a certainty built on a true account of who Jesus is and what He's done. You are going to build your life on a story you've already done. You've already done it. The question is not whether or not you will have certainty. You will do mentally, psychologically, what it takes to give yourself certainty. The question is whether your certainty will actually align with the truth. And does it align with what Christ is saying? We spend a couple minutes. I want to take some time to go before God. I want to lead you in prayer. And I really want to invite you to reflect honestly on your life, on the pieces of your story. This is going to be longer than 30 seconds or a minute. But as you reflect on your life, on pieces of your story, actually talk honestly with God. So I'm going to lead us in prayer, and it's a prayer for like us in the plural. But I invite you to pray these things personally. Would you take a moment and just quiet your heart before God? Maybe you need to ask Him to take a distraction away. You need to give something over to Him. Would you do that?